Sarah Palin would be catastrophic for the Republican Party in 2012, but she was great for the Republican Party in 2008. This, the political wisdom of the McCain-Palin campaign's chief strategist, Steve Schmidt. Our fourth story tonight, Mr. Schmidt's apparent reversal defending a governor who quit her job to save the country. Perhaps not that surprising, in so much as it comes from a man who told McCain to quit his campaign to save the economy. Schmidt made headlines just 2 weeks ago when he said nominating Palin for president in 2012 would be, quote, catastrophic for his party. But speaking last night at the University of Arkansas's Clinton School of Public Service, yes, the Clinton School of Public Service, Mr. Schmidt said, quote, I believe to this day that had she not been picked as the vice presidential candidate, we would never have been ahead. Not for 1 second, not for 1 minute, not for 1 hour, not for 1 day. He's stealing from Irvin Berlin. Asked to reconcile his 2008 and 2012 assessments, he then said, quote, I said what I said on the 2012 race. I said what I said today. Schmidt explained why McCain-Palin lost despite the Palin part. Quote, we were 3 points ahead on September 15th when the stock market crashed, and then the election was over. It's true, McCain and Palin were leading on September 15th, but what Mr. Schmidt fails to mention is that they started dropping from their post-convention, post-Palin bounce before September 15th, almost a week before. So what really coincided with the demise of McCain-Palin, and what light does it actually shed on the wisdom of having picked her? On the 11th of September last year, at the height of her ticket's popularity, but as negative stories about her began to gain traction, Governor Palin started to do interviews. According to the Real Clear Politics polling average, McCain-Palin dropped 1.5 points in the 4 days afterwards and never recovered. Let's turn to Chris Kofinas, Democratic strategist, communication director on the 2008 Edwards campaign. Chris, thanks for your time again tonight.
Good evening, Keith.
I say this slightly with tongue-in-cheek here, but did somebody get to Schmidt, or is he just trying to say, hey, she looks awful now, but boy, we were smart to pick her last year?
I think it's a bit of both. The funny thing is, I imagine there's some in the McCain campaign that are kind of sick and tired of the squabbling and backbiting about the 2008 campaign, in particular, given that it's almost 2010. I think the other piece of this is that, Steve Schmidt is sitting there making the argument 10 days ago that, she would be a catastrophic candidate in 2012. Well, if that's the case, it makes your choice and you're advising John McCain to choose her in 2008 not look very good. So it's him trying to basically back out of that. At the end of the day, it was a bad choice in 2008. It would be a bad choice in 2012. It would be a bad choice in any century, in any decade in the future. It's really that simple.
The revisionist element to this, too, this idea of the stock market killed McCain-Palin. As the polls suggest here, which are not being revised historically, these were the numbers then and they are the same numbers now, did they not start falling before the stock market did? And B, even if the stock market problems and the business problems did kill them, how is that an excuse? Why doesn't that mean, well, McCain really should have picked Mike Huckabee, who ran as this economic populist, or, Mr. Businessman Mitt Romney?
It wasn't the stock market that killed John McCain and his candidacy, and it wasn't choosing just simply Sarah Palin. Even before Sarah Palin, he was the wrong candidate at the wrong time with the wrong message and a terrible campaign. Choosing Sarah Palin just added to it. The notion that somehow Sarah Palin was not going to do a single interview between the time she was chosen and Election Day was ridiculous. I mean, think about the notion that they didn't basically vet her. They didn't test her before she was chosen as the vice president. I mean, and so this notion of somehow we were ahead, 6, 7, 8 weeks before Election Day. Well, those are kind of the immortal words of every losing campaign. If only Election Day was held on the day we were up in the polls. It doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, I think for Steve Schmidt, it's not only revisionist history, I think it's kind of exposing some terrible advice that John McCain was getting, which actually gives you an indication of how bad his campaign really was.
And there's something almost evil about this if you put it all together. I mean, does it not add up thusly that Mr. Schmidt is essentially saying the goal was nominate Sarah Palin, get her through the election without anybody figuring out, to use Mr. Schmidt's later term, that she would be a catastrophe?
Yeah, apparently so. I mean, this really, I think, kind of exposes what happens in the back rooms where advisors play a really key role with a lot of these candidates. I mean, and the notion that somehow John McCain just woke up and decided to choose Sarah Palin, that's not accurate. In fact, when you go back, and I read some of the reports from those many months ago, and what happened was a lot of these advisors were pushing Sarah Palin, including, if I'm not mistaken, Steve Schmidt. And so the notion of now turning around saying, oh, she would have been a catastrophe, well, what would have happened if John McCain had won and this catastrophe would have been a heartbeat away from the presidency. I mean, it does put into perspective, what an important event it was that Barack Obama won, that this catastrophe was nowhere near the White House, let alone what's going to happen in 2012.
It also kind of underscores this idea that the base of that party is somewhat separated from the mainstream of America, that you can call this a slightly center-left or a slightly center-right country, but it ain't a Sarah Palin country.
No, it's not a Sarah Palin country. And what's interesting is the whole infighting that's been happening within the Republican Party is between kind of two factions, between the, what I describe as the far right and the far out right. And, these ideological battles happen in both parties, but what's happening in the Republican Party is unique. And until they exercise those voices, this Republican Party is not going to basically recover.
Chris Kofinas, Democratic strategist. As always, thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Keith.